As the saying goes, a change is as good as a holiday. But when it comes to the most intimate part of our lives, such as our relationships, it's not always that easy. And joining us is clinical psychologist Lindile Mbata, who's here to discuss divorce and the profound impact it can have on our mental health. Welcome back, Slee.
Thank you for having me, Sarita.
So the stats show that in South Africa in particular, divorce rates are increasing exponentially. And I know that globally, they say half of first marriages end in divorce. That's kind of scary, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
Why is that happening?
Sure, I think it's so complex to actually figure out why this is happening. I think there's many reasons why. One of which is that, as society, I think our values are changing a lot. So
is that a good thing or?
Good and bad.
Okay.
Good and bad. I think in terms of marriage, we've seen the change in values really impact marriages in this way, in that, the old sort of family values that were there is not so much as present. We might not think about it in the same way that we did perhaps 50, 60 years ago. So the change in values is one, but I think also life has become difficult and complex in many ways that it hasn't been in years before this as well. So financially, there's a lot more strain on people than there used to be, emotionally, socially. So I think it's just that life looks very different than it did, and so marriages are ultimately going to look different as well.
I read this interesting article recently in Forbes magazine that said, it basically said that 75% of marriages that are ending on a whole are ending due to a lack of commitment. But a big part of that is also infidelity, of course. Then there is financial discernment in the relationship. There's gender-based violence. There's so much more. And I think back in the day, a lot of women in particular would push through, whereas women are so much more independent right now and have a voice and have agency over what they are willing to tolerate and not tolerate. But that aside, we can't get away from the fact that going through a divorce, whether you choose it or not, is a grieving process that definitely impacts your mental health, right? How does one stay in the healthiest position when you are in that position?
Yeah, sure. I mean, absolutely. You make such a good point about it being a grieving process. I mean, it's a loss. It's a loss of a very significant relationship, a loss of a family, for some people. So I think that for one, you can think about it in the same way you would possibly, going into it, we prepare a lot, right, for building families, don't we?
Yes.
We have so many conversations about what our hopes and dreams are, where we want to live, where we want to get married, and all these things. And I think when it comes to divorce, we often don't think about it in the same terms, in terms of preparation, the emotional and practical preparation for it. So I, would advise anybody who is contemplating this or is having any challenges in relationships to really think about in terms of, okay, how do I prepare myself for a process like this where my family might have to separate, or I might have to separate from my partner. So perhaps getting the support structures in early and not waiting for, the critical moment to happen before you then get those structures in. So whether it's seeing a counselor, whether it's starting to speak to family members, trusted people that you have in your life, you don't necessarily want to share with every single person, but I think already how do I prepare myself emotionally for this, practically, possibly financially, legally, you might just want to really have those structures in place before you make that decision. And just to also be able to anticipate, what could the possible outcomes be.
That's lovely. I don't know if you recall Gwyneth Paltrow and is it Chris Martin?
Yes.
Made famous the term conscious uncoupling, which I really resonate with, and I think is so beautiful to consciously uncouple. But the reality, the stark reality, is that so many divorces end so ugly, and both people are very seldom on the same page. So this wonderful process that you speak of in terms of preparation, as we prepare so beautifully for a wedding, we should, with the same kind of consciousness, prepare for our separation, yet we don't do that. So if one doesn't have a partner that is as conscious as you are, how do you navigate that process on your own when you know that you're not going to get support in terms of the conscious uncoupling?
Right, yeah. So I think, you might want to get help, even if it is on your own, on sort of starting to think about how am I going to have these conversations to say, okay, the relationship, I don't know if I can, it's sustainable anymore for myself, for us as a family. And then, possibly talking about what might the implications for us be. I think that sometimes when it comes to the separation and, the divorce actually happening, often it's sort of like it almost feels as if it has to happen in the heat of some moment. Yeah. It's because maybe there's been an infidelity, it's because there's been a betrayal. And we're not necessarily talking about it beforehand to sort of say, well, you can sense that. I think for a lot of people when a divorce is impending, very often there's an emotional separation that's already started happening.
Yes.
So I think that getting the support for yourself, even as a person who is just contemplating it, it might be a relief just to actually speak to someone to say, you know what, I'm thinking about it. I don't know what to do yet, but I'm thinking about it, and how can I start to perhaps have this conversation even with my partner to say, this is where my mind is at. Can we still do anything about it? Or should we actually be looking at ultimately going our separate ways?
Yeah, thank you, Slee. And then I want to ask you, if there are children involved, what is your advice regarding that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, divorces can have the biggest impact on children. The change in behavior that you can see in mood, in their performance, even at school, and how they interact with their friends. So I really would advise that we definitely keep an eye on the kids as a priority throughout the process. Sometimes you don't want to preempt too much of how the kids are going to deal with it. Kids might also be relieved when, in processes like this, when they happen, they might actually feel, oh, thank goodness it's finally happened, and they might be okay. But just to keep an eye on them and take note of any drastic changes in behavior, any changes in sort of academic performance at school, if they act out, if they withdraw a lot more than they did before. But if anything looks to you just a little bit off in terms of how your child might normally be, then I would suggest perhaps even a counselor, whether it's through the school first, but if you can do it privately as well, that's great. But just maybe keep an eye on it, and don't force it, don't preempt it.
Yeah.
Just kind of take stock and see what happens.
I like that. I'm definitely an advocate of counselling forever, for always. Going there with maintenance and service for yourself and your family is vital. Thank you so much once again. It's always a pleasure having you on the show. While divorce can be difficult, taking care of your mental health shouldn't be. So we hope that these insights by Slee has provided you with empowerment, that you know that you need to prioritize your mental health when it comes to navigating change or having to hit that reset button. After the break, we are sitting down with social media mogul Babalwa Mqaqiso, and we give you tips on how to reset your style for 2024.